We are very fortunate in having back with us again Miss Daisy Atterbury, who has been with us several times before, who is extremely interested and very active in the cause of the Republic of China. You've undoubtedly seen her exhibit down at the end of the mezzanine, and you may have had a chance to talk with her. She's an extraordinarily well-informed person, graduate of Wellesley College, and with many distinctions behind her as a lecturer and as a worker in this particular field. So I have no hesitation in presenting to you for your careful attention and later questioning if you can corner her at any particular point, but Miss Daisy Atterbury.
Colonel Bunker and General Robert L. Scott and fellow Americans, behold before you an historic confrontation. On one hand, you see General Robert L. Scott, leader of the Flying Tigers, the group which probably did more than any other force to keep Japan from conquering China. And on this side, you see Daisy Atterbury, one of the faceless millions who cowered in the bunkers and down in the cellars while the Japanese Air Force roared overhead, dropping their bombs. You cannot imagine the horror of the Japanese invasion of China. That has largely been forgotten, but not by those of us who lived through it. China was on the verge of one of the greatest upsurges in the history of the human race. Under President Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government, they are making tremendous progress. They had enlightened leaders. They had technical assistance from the League of Nations. They had wonderful cooperation with American experts in agriculture, in engineering, in medicine, in science. China was making a real great leap forward. They had defeated their own internal communist menace. That is forgotten. China was one of the few countries that defeated its own communist menace and drove them out of the country in 1934. The communists had taken over Jiangxi province and had turned it into a Soviet. They had done their usual raised their usual hell in that place, massacring the peasants and destroying the economy. When the National Army moved against them, the peasants rose to cooperate with the national troops to drive out their oppressors. The communists were driven out in 1934 on that historic long march, which they try to glamorize as a bunch of Robin Hoods, but they were really like marauding African ants. They left behind a shambles. I was told that when people went there 8 years later to distribute medicine, they found village after village with scarcely any men. And when they asked the women, "What's happened to your men?" the women said, "Oh, when the communists were driven out, they came around with their big, long knives, and they demanded that the men should go with them. They said, 'How can we leave our ancestral acres?' Well, off with their heads. They slaughtered or kidnapped every available man within that area." That was the communist regular system. And if anybody wants to call that those agrarian reformers, why, they ought to have their heads examined. That's all I can say. Well, the communists were driven out, and then Chiang Kai-shek and his wonderful constitutional government made a tremendous leap forward. And we had such a future to look forward to. Those were golden years. What Wordsworth said, "Bliss was it then to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." And China had every reason to think she was going to join the company of great, prosperous, free nations. But Japan was jealous. She said, "If we don't strike now, it'll be too late. China's getting ahead of us." And so in she came with a great army. And what do you suppose? She came in with Ford cars and American gasoline. She shelled us with the 6th Avenue L, maybe the 3rd Avenue L thrown in. Dr. Walter Judd was physician down in Fujian province. He said he took bushels of American-type scrap iron in the shrapnel he took out of Chinese bodies. Our merchants of death sold Japan everything she needed to conquer China with. I was told that Japan didn't have a single cracking plant at that time. All her high-octane gas for her bombing planes had to come from America. And we sold her plenty, and she stockpiled it for Pearl Harbor. But oh, when those planes swept overhead, the terror we felt. It's something so awful to have something overhead about to squash you. And down we went into the cellar, and there we were cowering in the dark. And we prayed, dear Lord, raise up champions that will protect China from this awful threat. We did not know how gloriously that prayer would be answered. Well, it wasn't until after Pearl Harbor we were all in concentration camp and we began to hear about the flying tigers and the simply miraculous exploits of General Scott. Here's a book, God is My Co-Pilot. You can get this book at the John Birch Society booth. Here it is available. Don't be without it. Every human being should have this in the world, especially Americans. And along with this, in a package deal, you get a speech by General Scott, which has been reprinted in the Congressional Record on what's happened to patriotism. When you study General Scott's life, you begin to feel you must be studying about a lot of people. How could one man accomplish so much? During the war, he flew 388 missions, shot down 22 planes. He was the top ace among the Allied forces. He became fighter commander of the whole China theater under General Chennault. And as I say, led the force that kept Japan from taking over China then. Sad to say, when Japan invaded China, poor Chiang Kai-shek had to retreat, trading space for time, and the communists came back. They filled the vacuum between the Japanese army and the retreating nationalist army. And they flooded in a raggedy army that was later, by courtesy of our State Department, to take over China and give China an even more terrible tyranny than the Japanese were ready to give. Well, when you read about how General Scott wrote God is My Co-Pilot, you can understand some of the ways that he accomplished so much. In 3 days, he dictated 120,000 words, which became this book, God is My Co-Pilot, and then a movie, which is still being given on television. And besides this, General Scott has written 12 other books, the last one of which, God is Still My Co-Pilot, which gives his analysis and estimate of the Vietnam War, the utterly incredible blunders that were made. As he says, if all the brains of America had gotten together to decide the worst way of fighting this war, they would have come up with something like what our plans have been there. They must have been dictated by the enemy. And this book, God is Still My Co-Pilot, is a wonderful explanation of why it is that we haven't yet won that war against a little country about the size of Michigan. Well, if only we could elect people like General Scott, President of the United States, maybe we'd get somewhere. Maybe. Maybe there's still a chance that in the next primaries we can have somebody that really knows the score and will really give our nation some leadership. Well, it's been a wonderful experience to come here year after year and get my batteries recharged. I live at Columbia University, where, well, we call it Moscow. We call it Moscow on the Hudson. And, well, I feel I'm the only sane person in a madhouse. Well, who's crazy? Then I come up here and I find there are other people that think the way I do, And I decide, well, maybe I'm not so crazy after all, because maybe they are. Because they are all saying, oh, well, Mao Zedong is the wave of the future, and he's killed 60 million people, but never mind. He's reformed, he's softening up, and look how he loves to see our boys play ping pong over there. I want to tell you, don't sneer at ping pong. Those ping pong balls make wonderful floats for swimming across to Hong Kong. And that's what they're being used for. They're put into sacks and used for water wings. And the people that are pouring out of communist China use those ping pong balls as floats to get across that 5 miles of open water till they can escape. And so the ping pong ball has its use. I'm very glad that I could be a voice for free China, wonderful, wonderful free China, 1/4 the human race. They elected constitutional government as their choice. Nobody ever elected Mao Zedong. They ran, they voted against him with their feet. And after the Korean War, 14,000 of the Chinese communist prisoners of war, that's 80% of all the prisoners taken, refused to go back to Mao Zedong and joined us on Taiwan. And we celebrate that every year, Freedom Day, January 23rd, when 80% of the Chinese communist prisoners of war took a plebiscite against Mao Zedong and joined our side. And I want to tell you, that's the proportion of people on the mainland who are still on our side and want to be with us and against that enemy, that alien enemy, that alien ideology. When the communists were driven out of China in 1934, one of their generals who came over to the side of the nationalists said, "Why, the communists, they are like a butcher shop that hang out a sheep's head and then sell dog meat," he said. "Why, they're just fakes, and they lie, and they deceive everybody. The Chinese people have found that out, but unfortunately, they are disarmed. And this gang of killers that is stamping them down is still in power. Power grows from the barrel of a gun. Instead of that, we have the side of our ally, we have the Constitution taken from the Gettysburg Address, this government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That is the Constitution of the China that's on our side on Taiwan. The China that has made Taiwan the show window of Asia. The people that have cooperated with the emerging nations of Africa, shown them how to quadruple their rice production and give them higher living standards all over. They are good neighbors of everybody, while the communists have sent forth the sabotage and the guerrillas to destroy the lives of others. Once a year, we have a magnificent international conference. You don't see this in the paper. This is one of the things that's swept under the rug, but it's one of the promising things, the good news for our side. It began as the Asian People's Anti-Communist League in 1954 with 5 member nations. It is now the World Anti-Communist League with over 50 member nations. It will meet in the middle of July in Manila. They will get delegates from all over Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, South America, and observers from the Americas. This is real Vietnamization, with the real Asiatization, you might say, of anti-communism, but combined with the forces of the free world against this enemy which is threatening all of us. We've got to stop Mao Zedong, as we've got to stop bubonic plague, as we've got to stop leprosy, and to bring him into the United Nations, right into the heart of America with diplomatic immunity. It's suicide. It's a dagger in the heart. We've got to pin on Mao Zedong the rap of being the biggest dope pusher in the world. We've got the documentation to prove this, and we're going to make it stick. We're going to associate in the mind of the American public Mao and dope, so that the Americans will shrink from him as they would shrink from leprosy or bubonic plague. That gang... That gang of killers must be kept out of our heartland, and instead we must restore the lawful rights of the people in the mainland in their own constitutional government, which is now on Taiwan. I am not only against Mao Zedong, I am for Christian leadership for 1/4 the human race, which is China. And here we have, God is my co-pilot. This is a wonderful motto, a wonderful slogan for every human being whom God created. Just think of what that means. In the Old Testament, we have the shepherd's psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for thou art with me." Well, now we don't have many shepherds, but we do have plenty of pilots, and to say that God is my co-pilot just describes a relationship so beautiful, so wonderful, so inspiring, and the birthright of every human being who comes into the world. Every child should be able to say, God is my co-pilot. Let's buy this book. Let's distribute it. Let's see that everyone we know has a copy of this book and knows also the experience that God is my co-pilot. And now we have the general who wrote this, who experienced this, and who will give us his own experience. And he says he will also answer questions afterwards if we have ideas and questions we want to bring up to someone who really knows the answers. I introduce General Robert L. Scott.
Thank you. Miss Atterbury, Colonel Bunker, ladies and gentlemen, out of respect for your days in China tonight, Miss Atterbury, I'm going to concentrate a little more on China than I usually get to in a talk. And also, I've just almost completed speeches ever since April all across the South. In fact, while I was listening to Dr. Evans, I was thinking about, I've been over halfway around the world, from here to Hanoi at least, through our Mississippi and Texas and Georgia and Florida and on up the Carolinas since April. In Florida, I also met one of the finest groups of Eastern Airline pilots I've ever met, running train committees. So out of respect for them, I've got to tell a few flying stories tonight. You see, a good many things happened to me in China which have stayed with me, became veritably a part of me, as I was reminded a month or so ago when the 17th bit of alien metal had to be removed. During these speeches, I can still feel the stitches. The other memories are better. I met John Birch one Sunday afternoon, dressed as a Chinese coolie. I came to know him and know his bravery, his modest bravery, after General Chenault had introduced us, both of us being from Macon, Georgia. Of course, I never will forget either of those men, the man Robert Welch found good enough to name the society for, and my boss, General Chenault, a man who knew the communist menace even then. As I used to stand around, as I did one Christmas Day, and tell how I shot 5 down that day, I'll never forget General Chenault said, "Scotty, don't kill all these Japanese. You don't even know who the enemy is out here yet." And then he told me about the communists. I lied my way to China, L-I-E-D, lied, in case my southern accent hadn't gotten familiar yet. I figured that to reach combat, and men who were fighting back there in 1942, that to tell a lie was all right. It got me a B-17. They told me I was too old to be a fighter pilot at 33. But the Japanese were smarter than we thought, and they had caught on to the fields that we were going to use to bomb Tokyo at Chujo-Lishue. And so I had the opportunity of chiseling my first fighter, and escaping the fate worse than death, flying that unarmed Goonie bird over territory that was inhabited by enemy planes. I got 101 or 105 holes in my plane one day, and I couldn't even pray that night because I wouldn't have been there if I hadn't told that lie. The guest appearances that came as an accident with the Flying Tigers, I get all the credit now of being a Flying Tiger. They came into my group on July the 4th, 1942. I really never was a Flying Tiger. I led them. I probably never would have shot down all those airplanes, except I'd look over this shoulder and there was Tex Hill with 16 victories, whose father had been the chaplain of the Texas Rangers. He was born in Shanghai. On this side would be Ed Rector from Marshall, North Carolina, with 14. And so when we saw a glint in the sky, I would hit emergency power right away. That's when you go to 3,000 RPMs, and you can only stay there about 3 minutes before the engine burns up. But I'd get this Japanese plane. I had to. These men I was leading had more than I thought I would ever get. Finally, after chiseling the plane from General Chennault in this Goonie bird, I began to deliver the equipment of war over the hump to him. I came upon him one afternoon at Loy Wing, Burma. And after landing the plane on this muddy field, a Goonie bird, that's a DC-3 with a big door, I had 16 drums of gasoline, 55 gallons each, machine gun ammunition boxes sitting on each one of those, and some 500-pound bombs. But I didn't know that the regular establishment, I guess Dr. Evans would know they were insiders even then, they had been delivering General Chennault what he wanted for destroying the Japanese or the enemy, but what they wanted him to have: filing cabinets, paper, such as that, GI cans. But I had dumped all that out, and I had brought him the real articles of war. But nevertheless, as I landed on this muddy field, instead of someone rushing out and putting his arms around me, General Chennault said, "Get off the field. The Japanese will be here in 5 minutes, and that'll be the first thing they'll hit, that transport." I had Sergeant Al Tonin hold the big door open and point at the rusty drums, 16 of them, and when Chennault saw that, he turned and went away figuring we'd have to unload, and with an admonition for me to get it off the field as fast as I could. I ran after General Chennault because I'd been on the way to meet him a long time. He was in a slit trench calling orders to Tex Hill, who was leading the squadron of Flying Tigers that day. They were something like 20,000 feet over the field. That's on the Burma Road. And I couldn't see him, but General Chennault was talking with him and saying, "Now, Tex, I'll tell you when to come in, as soon as the Japs hit the field." I looked out on the runway, and there sat my destiny, a P-40. A lone P-40 with its shark mouth painted on, as though it were dripping saliva. I jumped in the slit trench and grabbed General Chennault by the elbow and said, "General, I'm not a transport pilot, although you caught me flying that thing. I won't tell you the whole story, but I'm the greatest fighter pilot in the world. And I've been on the way to meet you. I'd even been reprimanded by the Army for trying to fight a non-belligerent long before December the 7th. And General Chennault gave me a withering look and said, "Son, you're too high-ranking," as he looked at these colonel's eagles, "and besides that, you're in the wrong color uniform. That's a Chinese airplane. Can't you see that blue and white sun on the wing?" And I made the right remark. I said, "Sir, I thought it didn't matter with you what uniform a man wore or how high-ranking he was if he just wanted to fight." And as an afterthought, General Chennault said, "Get it and get off the field. They'll be here in 2 minutes. It started just like that. And a P-40 doesn't start the first time every now and then. It was that co-pilot helping me out. I swerved off the PSP, that's pierced steel plank. That's what you travel on as a runway. You don't have concrete, and your P-40 won't taxi through the mud. And I swung out into what was the runway, a PSP also, and took off. I'd like to tell you that I caught the enemy. I didn't even find the friends that day. In fact, I couldn't find Loy Wing. By the time I had looked around, there were no maps in the airplane. I went to 18,000 feet as fast as I could. I looked around for Tex Hill with his P-40, the real Flying Tigers. Then I began to look around for the enemy, and then I began to hope that I wouldn't find them. That afternoon, when I was 45 minutes overdue out of gasoline by leaning the mixture, I found Loy Wing again. And I landed, and a very nervous General Chennault was walking up and down in front of the hard stand. That's where you park a ship on the PSP. And he says, get out of the ship, Scott, and we better come and have a drink. He said, I want to talk to you. He said, you're the first colonel I've ever seen who could really fire one of these. And I've been worried that I was going to have to radio General Arnold tonight that I had lost the only colonel I'd ever seen that wanted to fight. But he said, you talked me out of that ship, but I just wanted to tell you that I don't see how you started it. We've been trying to start that airplane for 30 days. And he says, that's a hangar queen. It's what we take the bad carburetors off the other airplanes and put on, and the bad wheels. And so that caused General Chennault to give me a P-40. And three or 4 days later, 5 of the Flying Tigers came through Dinjan, India, where I was flying the Goonie Bird from then. This was April 1942. And a fellow by the name of R.T. Smith let me pick out the airplane that I wanted, and another one stayed back there to teach me the tactics of Chennault, how to use this 9,400-pound airplane to fight a light Japanese that weighed 6,100 and a light Japanese pilot that weighed 100 as opposed to my 175, and his had 1,200 horsepower, mine had 1,000. So General Chennault wasn't taking any chances. And with that airplane, I became the one-man Air Force, the scourge of the Japanese. The newspaper said I wasn't doing a bit of good. But I began to fly guest missions with the Flying Tigers, and thereby hangs the tale. The first 6 missions, I thought they were the most unselfish men in the world. We would go down over Hanoi, down the River Rouge from Mongsu, which is in the south end of the province of Yunnan, and we would follow this little narrow gauge railroad which led down to Hanoi, and we would see a train going along, and we'd be up at 18,000 feet, and the head of the Flying Tigers would say, Colonel, do you want to go down and get that train? And I'd say, yes, sir, and I would hit my gun switches and dive at the train and get a few more holes in my airplane and look up there, and they would still be waiting for me. And I said, they're giving me all the targets. These are the finest men I've ever met. It wasn't until the 6th mission I realized they were trying to get me killed. They hated regulars. I was a West Point Ring regular, and General Chennault had been kicked out of our army at age 47 in 1937 with the flimsy excuse he was hard of hearing. And so now I was out there to meet him, and I couldn't get with him. Well, the last 11 missions, evidently he called them in and said, now, keep this man alive. We've got to use him. And on July the 4th, 1942, I got the best job in the world, the command of the Flying Tigers. They were inducted into the United States Army Air Corps. There was no Air Force then. Now, therein hangs the other tale. July the 2nd, 29 years ago today, we heard Tokyo Rose say, we know who's taken over the Flying Tigers. He's a playboy from Hollywood, a man named Scott. Now, we're going to kill them all on July the 4th. Repeat after me, more or less, she said, and explained exactly what the Imperial Japanese Air Force was going to do. While I sat there with General Chennault at his dining table on the 6,000-foot high field in Kunming, had dinner with General Chennault in the house that Generalissimo had built for him, and when Tokyo Rose had said her words, General Chennault turned to me, knowing I was going to take over the Flying Tigers, and said, all right, Scotty, you've heard what she said. What are you going to do? I said, well, sir, we're not going to wait for her. We're going to attack the Japanese on July the 4th. And General Chennault got up and says, well, you've at least learned to be offensive and never defensive, but you got your dates all wrong. This was the 2nd of July, remember. He says, you're going to hit them on the 3rd. We weren't even organized, remember, till the 4th. And I almost made a mistake. I almost said, but sir, we're not activated till the 4th. But I didn't. And he told me then what to do. And I took off that afternoon with all my ships, 29 of them, representing the greatest country in the world. 29 airplanes that no other country would have. We tried to give them to the British. We tried to give them to the Australians. But Chennault knew how to use them. And we didn't fly those 29 planes straight 500 miles from the Yunnan province to the Guangxi province. We flew them 3 over this village, 5 over that village, 7 over this village, never all of them together. And when by the time their spies on the ground had reported those 29 airplanes going to Guilin, evidently 500 had gone to Guilin. But I didn't understand all that then. And we got to Guilin where we lived in a cave, stalagmites and stalactites hanging down, water dripping all the time. And we had the air warning system that worked by human beings with telephones and semaphores and by runners going across fields, large unidentified enemy aircraft formation going overhead. And you would have little flags moving on the board showing where the enemy was coming from. And in this cave, we waited for the enemy to come on July the 3rd. But on the 3rd, General Chennault, at a prearranged signal, sent me up above the field. They were coming for one more raid on the field, and we left back there bamboo dummies, each with a 5-gallon can of gasoline in it. And I went up as high as my plane would go, the old heavy P-40, and circled back and forth into the sun, watching the Japanese come, and there were 24 over here, 24 here, 24 here, 96. And my heart got way up here that July the 3rd, and your hand begins to perspire to where it melts the black rubber on top of the stick, and your hand looks dirty every now and then. You wipe it off on your flying suit. And as the Japanese came up and saw these dummies on the field, canvas-colored, painted with the shark mouth, they began to dive and burn them up. And my hand almost itched to push that stick forward and go down and get them, because I knew we'd all be killed. We didn't have but 19 ships by that time. These others had gotten out of commission. And I kept waiting, wondering, why doesn't General Chennault send me down? And only after the Japanese had burned up all the dummies and were beginning to catch on themselves that something was wrong, it had been too easy. Then they were beginning to do acrobatics, showing that they were just showing off. Only then did Chennault say, take them. And we went down and shot every single one of the 96 down. We had to follow some back to Hong Kong. Now, I'm a little bit sorry you applauded, because I think the applause might be, that's a brave guy standing up there. I deserved none of it. When I had gotten 5 airplanes and became an ace, I used to look in the mirror and say, Scott, you weren't too old. And by the time I got 10, I realized that General Chennault had told me where to go, what to do. I was the long extension of his arm. And that day, when I got back, very cockily, I walked into the cave, and General Chennault said, Scotty, any questions? And I said, yes, sir. Why and let me take them when they first got here? He says, now, Scotty, suppose you'd been that Japanese commander. You first got here and you saw all those ships, nice, juicy targets on the field. What would you have been thinking of? And I said, how many I was going to get, sir, before they got off the ground? He said, son, that's what that Japanese commander was thinking about. But after he burned them all up and had used a lot of gasoline, what do you think he was thinking about? And I said, did I have enough gasoline to get back home, sir? He said, that's the reason you got them like you did. General Chennault was the key. We took those sorry airplanes, the Flying Tigers did, in 1 month and destroyed 299 enemy aircraft, losing 8. I learned another thing in China. A Chinese warlord, a philosopher or a sage or something by the name of Sun Tzu is supposed to have said, supreme excellence in warfare is having the enemy surrender before the battle. Of course, I don't imagine supreme excellence is reached very often in war or getting ready for war or even in peace by any peoples or nations or civilizations. But in my opinion, as far as holding peace in this world, we did reach that point of supreme excellence momentarily at the end of World War II. Now, though, let me lead up to how we reached it. I've just told you a personal story of my service under a general who won with next to nothing because of positive leadership. Just let us compare that with our recent tactics since the so-called peace arrived in our civilization. Our carefully planned failures, conceived and executed by the greatest brains in our land as they snatched defeat from certain victory. I say to you, he said, the nation which can land an army upon the beaches of Normandy to capture a continent in 1944, which cannot now capture a dinky little beachhead of guerrillas in Vietnam, I say this country needs a change. Those words we all recognize as those of our president accepting the nomination of his party at Miami Beach in 1968. It was an inspiring speech. Faith was restored a little bit to us all. He would put a halt to the riots in our streets, the same as on the captured campuses of this land. Dignity would be restored to our police, and on and on. America believed him and elected him, and we had that change. Only there have been no changes. So we are still bogged down in that no-win war of attrition. Exactly where the enemy wants us, so we write letters to our president. And here is one of those answers, a startling reply when one considers the old Chinese proverb about supreme excellence. Just as this evasive, to say the least, letter rambles on, saying nothing, it is in the name of our president, and so must be the policy of this administration. Leading me to conclusion, our policymakers, whoever they actually are not mere fumblers or fools doing the best they can in their complicated, thankless jobs, but many of them have to be part of this great conspiracy, following carefully laid plans for our convergence with the Soviet Union. With the Soviet Union as the basis for a dictatorial government of the world, whereas Senator Fulbright states that there will be no armies, no navies, no air forces, except those of the United Nations. In fact, there won't be any United States. The letter that I had merely said that we're not trying to destroy one enemy or one country and save another. We're trying to learn how to fight a war with a form of gradualism which can make friends of them both. We have been sold out, not by the communists, we should know by now, are our enemies, but by Americans among us. And I am not going into warnings about the Council of Foreign Relations or the erosion of our Constitution, as I do around the United States, because here I realize I'm talking to professionals in Americanism, and I surely don't want to talk down to you. But as for what I learned of peace and warfare under General Chennault in China, and through a life as a professional soldier, I must discuss what is at least a possibility. A great part of our training process for our young, and that older silent majority too, has been carried out by way of that most educational of all mediums, television, and it is therefrom which the poison of peace that I discuss emanates. The manner in which we not only permit its use, but encourage its use by buying of its pills and its portions and paying for it. We make of television a veritable weapon in the hands of the enemy, the most dangerous weapon, replacing even the bomb. Take the Cali case. for it's far more important than a little lieutenant and a burned-out cluster of villages in the Kwanggai province. Both are mighty milestones along the route of the planned destruction of our professional military system, of which this nation has always been so proud. Oh, how the years have changed since I was a boy, the pride in those organizations. I'd have crawled across my state of Georgia to enlist, and had I thought I could fly those airplanes all those miles, I'd have crawled over broken glass. And the proudest days of my life have been spent in that uniform. But now, we have sat by while the enemy has aided in destroying the morale and the esprit de corps of all our armed forces. Today, when I see a man who dares to go abroad in uniform, I feel like saluting him, just for having the nerve to wear it and subject himself to the abuse he's liable to find right in the streets of home. I find it hard to recommend the services now as any career for a young man, which used to say those services so confidently from every billboard, almost every telephone post, every post office. I want you, as Uncle Sam pointed his accusing finger. All that is now changed to weekly plead. The Army wants to join you. Design your own uniform. Let your hair grow. Beer in the barracks, no discipline. It may be an overused and worn-out cliche, but nothing else fits the case so appropriately. How stupid can we get? And as to the probability of a drug problem in our services, which the President announced by Associated Press the other day was our #1 problem. If my country had trained me to kill my enemies with the most sophisticated weapons of all time, displaced me from my home and my family, and sent me over to the hellholes that we always managed to fight our wars in, and then instead of letting me fight and come home as fast as the dirty job could have been done, instead made me to sit out there in abject boredom, maybe I would have tried to lose myself in the fumes of pot too. So if there is a drug problem, our leaders are responsible for that too. None of our young men we ordered away to fight for us had anything to do with any involvement in Vietnam. None of our old soldiers had anything to do with being there either. In fact, every professional I ever heard of, from General MacArthur on, advised against any land war involvement in Asia. Our men were ordered there anyway by the failure of our diplomats and other politicians, after another generation of young men had fought and many of them had died and had won a victory. Only then did our diplomats and our politicians and those of the enemy meet and decide they couldn't keep the peace. Only after they had taken over and had admitted failure, they called on the military again. Then we sent our sons away to do the dirtiest job in the world, and we broke all the rules. We gave them the backs of our hands. They had all the obvious weapons. They had none of the least obvious and the most important, such as our unswerving support. The war we failed to make our Congress call what it was, a war, propagandized by our enemy with our help to be the most unpopular conflict in history. Propagandized until every American became sick and tired of the word Vietnam, became conditioned by enemy propaganda. Only in such a way could we have been soulless enough to sit indifferently by and watch our armed services used, even brought home in chains to be tried as war criminals. Exactly what the communist enemy had counted on from what they called the fat, decadent democracy. They had found the way to destroy our armed forces without ever having to face them in battle, where backed by us at home, no enemy on the face of the earth would have had a chance. In a lighter vein, I can't help comparing my return from World War II with that today of the long-suffering GI. For I was as much murderer as 10 Callies, if soldiers are such in the performance of their duty. I'd killed more enemy human beings, doubtless, not just those in the planes I destroyed. I hope every one of those pilots got out. But in my strafing of troop columns through innocent native villages then in Burma and China, in Indochina and Korea. But murderer though I could have been, my hometown gave me a full-fledged parade. They still respected me. They even loved me. They rented a water buffalo at great expense from a circus down in Sarasota so I could ride in splendor up Cherry Street in Macon, Georgia. They just didn't know how scared I was of that cantankerous, sharp-horned animal. Because in China I had learned he hated everybody except the Chinese. I rode him, though. That ride was as harrowing as any combat mission, but there wasn't any way to get out of it. It was Robert Scott Day in Macon, and the governor had even declared it Robert Scott Day. But look at the change. Compare that with the return of the men in uniform today, our modern Jobs. They are not all treated bad as Callie, but the uniform has lost any glamour it might once had, and those real forgotten ones, our 1,600 prisoners, we forget more each day. The enemy tortures and starves. Never forget what that more ambitious than brilliant presidential hopeful Senator George McGovern said about them a few weeks ago, when he was reminded that just to arbitrarily pull out of Vietnam, as he advocated in campaign speeches, would leave all those men of ours hopelessly abandoned. His reply was, so what? They never should have been over there fighting this war of aggression. Well, for McGovern's benefit, we save the lowest blow of all for a few of our sons who make it home. At least their ashes come back in those pathetic plastic bags. I brought a plane load of them home, serving as military escort, and I was ashamed of what happened. In several towns, I was asked on the West Coast by jittery local officials to please deliver the deceased servicemen quietly and without ceremony, in the interest of lessening the probability of anti-war demonstrations. We have become a nation of cowards. We fail to make absolutely certain that such men be honored by every American he died for, even if we take him to his grave with rifles loaded and at the ready. This is so very important, especially to each member of this crucial generation, because every other American today fits into that category, 100 million of them. From numbers alone, this is our most vital element of society. It's not only imperative that they be given a chance to understand, but that we absolutely guarantee them the true facts of their heritage that we have permitted them to accept so lightly and have even let be slanted by television. And don't forget those elite 1,400 members of the CFR. They control communications media. The Battle of Vietnam never has been fought over there in that sad country. It's been fought right here at home in the press, on television, with squadrons of actors and writers commanded by producers and high corporate officers I cannot conceive as being Americans. We hear our news shaped and slanted and interpreted and evaluated, even though testimony may have just come from the admirals and the generals of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in sworn testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, or by soldiers and airmen, Marines and sailors who have been there in that Vietnam purgatory. We see it all so easily destroyed by the simple shrug of a shoulder, the inflection of a trained voice, the quizzical raising of a high-salaried eyebrow. Freedom of the press cannot be ignored. If it's not in real American hands, we better find out whose hands it's in, because this This is a new kind of war, and the miracle media is a weapon. Similarly, most Americans have been taught by that media to have a guilt complex about a horror we invented called the atomic bomb. As terrible an accomplishment as that was, I still see as a trust assigned this nation. We were made its custodians by the will of God. After he had looked down and been disgusted at all civilization, the Norwegians were close to it because they had heavy water in Norway. That's why Hitler went in there. Suppose Hitler had cracked the atom or split the atom and had learned what our Manhattan project learned. At the same time, he was launching the V-1s and V-2s from Peenemünde. It was delivered in our hands for stopping World War II. No matter if we did kill the enemy, we saved 1 million American lives. They were poised and ready to invade the Japanese islands. And after that, if we had kept the secret, it would have remained the true deterrent for preventing further wars. What that capability actually meant was stability for this whole world. The United States had the power to dominate for peace. There wasn't any need to destroy any part of the world. We could have guaranteed peace with absolute power. We had the power of extreme excellence in warfare. We could have made the enemy do anything we want. Never before in all history had any nation such an overwhelming superiority over its enemies, nor such a sacred trust to hold for its weaker friends. In 1945, the United States held that key, held the power to lead for freedom. Instead of leading, we retreated, and we've been retreating ever since. The enemy disarmed the United States with propaganda by instilling in gullible people who loved comforts and pleasures and this so-called peace, the poison peace, more than honor and heritage. Instilled in them a mission for a fanatic search for peace, which to me is ideally represented in that pagan broken cross. Peace. Any non-existence of a declared war became our goal above all else. American might was nullified. The free world was open to communist aggression. Our capability didn't deter Stalin because Americans, building those cultural bridges of understanding they talk about, were giving him and selling him atomic secrets right out the back door of the White House. He knew too well also the fixation the dying Roosevelt had of creating permanent peace through that fanciful dream, the United Nations. The fixation had swung the full cycle since the administration of Woodrow Wilson. Only back there, about the same idea had been labeled the League of Nations. Where FDR had Harry Hopkins living in the White House, President Wilson had his Colonel House living there, who substituted the CFR for the League of Nations. That monstrosity our Senate thought they had defeated and put an end to. You see, our enemy is most formidable. He knew all about that second effort way back there, and his poison has been permeating us, conditioning us to accept this, anything in the guise of peace.
I want to say something. Thank you, Dr. Atterbury, and thank you very much, General Scott. You've given us one of the most magnificent talks I have ever heard.